The blizzard had been raging for 11 days when Jakob Schneider watched smoke still rising from Tobias Reichert's chimney across the valley. Even though no one had seen Tobias emerge from his cabin since the storm began. Every other homestead within 5 miles had gone dark by day 7, families huddling under blankets as their firewood ran out, but Tobias's cabin glowed warm through the whiteout like he had an endless supply appearing by magic. Before we go further, let us know in the comments what part of Appalachia you're watching from, and if stories like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable. The winter of 1842 arrived in the western Virginia mountains with deceptive gentleness. Tobias Reichert stood outside his cabin on a cold February morning, watching clouds gather over the ridgeline, and felt no particular alarm. He was 41 years old, a German immigrant who had spent 12 winters in these Appalachian hills. He understood mountain weather, or thought he did. His homestead sat in a narrow valley surrounded by hardwood forest, a clearing he had carved from wilderness over years of patient work. The main cabin was solid construction, chinked logs with a stone fireplace. 30 feet away stood his woodshed, built deliberately separate to reduce fire risk. A small barn housed his 2 cows and handful of chickens. The layout was practical, efficient, typical of successful frontier homesteads. Inside the cabin, his wife Anna was preparing their midday meal. She was 38 years old, strong and capable, a partner who had endured the hardships of mountain life without complaint. Their son Emil, 9 years old, was supposed to be splitting kindling, but was instead building small structures from wood scraps near the fireplace. Tobias smiled at the boy's imagination. Emil had his mother's patience and his father's interest in how things were built. The storm began as light snow around noon. Tobias needed to check his trap lines before conditions worsened. Trapping provided crucial income during winter months when other work was impossible. He told Anna he would return before dark, kissed Emil's head, and headed into the forest with his rifle and pack. The trap lines ran along a creek 2 miles from the cabin, a route he had walked hundreds of times. By mid-afternoon, the snow had intensified. What had seemed like a minor storm was developing into something more serious. Temperature dropped rapidly, wind picked up, driving snow horizontally through the trees. Tobias checked his traps quickly, finding 2 marten and a fox, and started back toward home. The return journey took 3 hours instead of the usual 45 minutes. He fought through deepening snow, using familiar landmarks to navigate as visibility decreased. When he finally emerged from the tree line and saw his cabin, relief flooded through him. Smoke rose from the chimney. The windows glowed with firelight. Everything appeared normal. Then he saw the shapes in the snow between the cabin and woodshed. 2 forms, partially covered by accumulated snowfall. Tobias ran forward, already knowing but refusing to believe. Anna lay 15 feet from the cabin door. Emil was 10 feet beyond her, small arms outstretched. Scattered around them were pieces of firewood they had been trying to carry. Tobias understood what had happened with terrible clarity. The cabin's interior wood supply had run out. Anna had looked outside and seen the woodshed just 30 feet away, a distance that seemed trivial under normal conditions. She had made a decision that thousands of frontier women made without incident. Wrap up, run to the shed, grab an armload of wood, return quickly. She had taken Emil with her, probably thinking 2 people could carry more wood in a single trip. The storm had been worse than it appeared from inside. The wind chill had been deadly. Disorientation had set in within seconds. They had never made it to the shed. On the return journey, laden with wood, they had become confused in the whiteout. 15 feet from safety, they had frozen to death. Tobias carried their bodies inside and sat with them through the night. The fire burned low. He fed it mechanically, watching the flames without seeing them. When dawn came, the storm had passed. The sky was clear and brutally cold. He couldn't bury them in frozen ground, so he wrapped them carefully and placed them in the small barn, where animals and cold would preserve them until spring thaw allowed proper burial. He moved through the following weeks in mechanical routine. He tended his animals. He ate because his body required fuel. He checked trap lines because furs meant survival currency. But his mind was consumed by a single repeating thought. 30 feet had killed his family. 30 feet of open ground between cabin and woodshed had been an impassable barrier during a storm that had lasted less than 6 hours. In April, when the ground softened enough for digging, he buried Anna and Emil on a hillside overlooking the valley. He marked their graves with stones he had shaped himself, carving their names and dates with patient precision. He spoke no words over them. There were no neighbors close enough to gather for a service. He simply stood there for a long time, then walked back to his empty cabin. That night, sitting alone by the fire, Tobias began thinking about the problem with the intensity that would define the rest of his life. Other settlers accepted that winter was dangerous. They stockpiled wood inside their cabins, despite the fire risk and lost living space. They built smaller sheds closer to their doors. They simply accepted that severe weather sometimes required dangerous trips outside. Tobias could not accept these solutions. Storing wood inside meant living in a fire hazard. Anna had died because she'd tried to solve that exact problem. Building the shed closer meant risking the entire homestead if the shed caught fire. He stared at his cabin floor, thinking about the space beneath it. The cabin sat on a stone foundation with the floor joists elevated 18 inches above ground level. That gap existed in every frontier cabin, necessary for drainage and air circulation. What if that space could serve another purpose? Tobias spent the last weeks of spring studying his homestead with new eyes. He walked the 30 feet between cabin and woodshed dozens of times, measuring the distance, examining the terrain. The ground sloped slightly downward from the cabin toward the shed, perhaps 6 inches of drop over the distance. Good for drainage, he noted. Water would flow away from both structures naturally. He examined his cabin's foundation closely. The structure sat on stacked fieldstone, 3 courses high, creating a stable base. The floor joists rested on top of the stone, with the floorboards nailed across them. That 18-inch gap underneath was currently just empty space. He had learned carpentry in Germany as a young man, working with his father on building projects in their village. The techniques were formal, precise, very different from the rough frontier construction most American settlers used. But Tobias understood structural principles. He knew how weight distributed through joined timbers. He knew which woods resisted rot and which failed quickly in damp conditions. Most importantly, he understood that cabin walls were essentially horizontal log tubes, strong because each log supported the ones above and below it. What if he built that same structure underground? Not a mine shaft or a cellar, but a horizontal passage using the same log stacking technique that made cabin walls strong. The idea seemed possible. He began planning in detail, sketching crude diagrams on birch bark with charcoal. The passage would need to be wide enough to crawl through comfortably, high enough to move a loaded sled. 3 feet of interior clearance seemed adequate. With log walls and a log roof, that meant the excavation would need to be roughly 4 feet deep and 5 feet wide to accommodate the log structure inside it. In late May, when the ground had fully thawed and dried enough to work, Tobias began digging. He started at the woodshed, excavating a trench that ran from the shed's foundation toward the cabin. The work was backbreaking. Each shovelful of earth had to be moved away from the work area. He dug methodically, keeping the trench walls as vertical as possible, maintaining consistent depth. Neighbors who passed by and saw him working thought grief had broken his mind. Jakob Schneider, whose homestead was a mile to the east, stopped one afternoon and watched Tobias digging. "What are you building, Tobias?" Jakob asked carefully, using the tone people employed with those whose sanity was questionable. "A passage," Tobias replied without stopping his work. "From the shed to the cabin." "A passage? You mean like a path?" "Under the ground." Jakob was quiet for a moment. "Tobias, if you need more wood storage, just stack it inside the cabin. Most folks do that." Tobias stopped digging and looked at Jakob directly. "Fire takes the cabin, Jakob." "I need the shed supply accessible without stepping outside." "Without stepping outside?" "Tobias, it's 30 feet. 30 feet killed Anna and Emil." Jakob left without further argument. but Tobias knew the story would spread. The German who lost his family was now digging trenches like a man possessed, talking about passages under the ground. Let them talk. He had work to do. By mid-June, the trench extended 15 feet from the woodshed toward the cabin. The excavation was 4 feet deep, 5 feet wide, with relatively straight walls. Now came the actual construction, the part that would determine whether his idea was madness or innovation. Tobias selected logs with the same obsessive care he had once used for building the cabin itself. He wanted straight trees, 8 to 10 inches in diameter, with minimal taper. He spent a week cutting and hauling suitable logs, rejecting any that showed rot, excessive knots, or irregular shape. Once he had sufficient material, he began the process of preparing them. He stripped every log completely, removing all bark with a draw knife. Bark held moisture, attracted insects, and created irregular surfaces. Bare wood could be fitted together much more tightly. The construction technique was simple in concept but demanding in execution. He laid the first log at the bottom of the trench, positioned lengthwise along the passage direction. He placed a second log parallel to it on the opposite side, creating the side walls of his tunnel. Then he laid logs perpendicular across the top, spanning between the two side logs, creating a roof. The perpendicular logs rested in notches. He cut into the side logs the same basic joinery used in cabin corner construction. Each joint was secured with wooden pegs driven through drilled holes. This created a box structure, a rectangular tube of logs lying horizontally in the trench. The interior space was approximately 3 feet wide and 3 feet high, adequate for crawling or pulling a sled. Tobias built the tunnel in sections, completing each 4-foot segment before moving forward. After completing each section, he tested it by carefully backfilling earth around and over it, then walking on top. The log structure held perfectly, supporting his weight plus the soil without any deflection he could detect. The work progressed slowly through June and into July. Each section took 2 to 3 days to complete, selecting and fitting logs, cutting notches, drilling holes, driving pegs, backfilling earth. Tobias worked alone, methodically, with the patience of someone who understood that good construction could not be rushed. By late July, the tunnel extended from the woodshed to within 3 feet of the cabin foundation. Now came the most delicate and dangerous phase, breaching his own cabin's structural base. The cabin foundation consisted of stacked fieldstone, 3 courses high, with the heavy sill logs resting directly on top. Those sill logs supported the entire wall structure above them. To create a passage through the foundation, Tobias would need to temporarily support the sill log while he created an opening beneath it, then build a permanent structure that would carry the weight without compromising the cabin's integrity. One mistake could cause settlement, cracking, or even partial collapse. Tobias approached the foundation breach with extreme caution. He began by excavating under the foundation stones, removing earth one careful shovelful at a time. He worked from both sides, creating a void that extended 3 feet wide directly under the sill log. As he dug, he inserted temporary support posts, thick vertical logs that he wedged tightly between the bottom of the excavation and the underside of the sill log. These props transferred the weight around the area he was working, preventing any settling. With the temporary supports in place, he built the permanent structure. He set 2 heavy vertical posts on either side of the opening, each one sitting on flat stones at the bottom of his excavation. Across the tops of these posts, he laid a massive horizontal beam, a single oak log 12 inches in diameter that he had shaped flat on top. This beam would carry the weight of the sill log and everything above it. He fitted the beam carefully, using wooden wedges to adjust its height until it made solid contact with the underside of the sill log. Then he drove additional wedges around the entire perimeter, creating an absolutely rigid connection. The result was essentially a door frame built into the foundation, strong enough to support the cabin structure while creating a 3-foot wide opening. He removed the temporary props one at a time, monitoring carefully for any movement. Nothing shifted. The cabin remained perfectly stable. He had successfully breached his own foundation without compromising its integrity. Inside the cabin, he marked the location where the tunnel would emerge. The spot was near the back wall, in a corner where it would be least intrusive to daily living. He carefully removed a section of floorboards, cutting through 3 planks to create an opening 3 feet by 2 feet. Below the floorboards, he could see down through the floor joists to the ground beneath. He cut through 1 floor joist, supporting the cut ends with additional blocking, and suddenly he was looking down into his tunnel entrance. The opening was perfect, aligned precisely with the passage that ran under the foundation and out to the woodshed. The tunnel was complete by late August of 1843. 4 months of work had created an 18-foot passage connecting his woodshed to the interior of his cabin. But the system required one more critical component: a way to transport wood through the passage efficiently. Tobias spent a week building a specialized sled. The dimensions were crucial. The tunnel interior was 3 feet wide. The sled needed to fit with enough clearance to move freely, but not so much space that it would tip or jam. He settled on a design 2 feet wide and 4 feet long, with a bed height of 8 inches. He built it from ash wood, known for its strength and flexibility. The runners were smooth and slightly curved at the front. The bed was reinforced with cross braces. At the front, he attached a thick rope with a loop handle for pulling. The first test of the complete system happened on a late August afternoon when Tobias loaded the sled with split firewood in the woodshed. He stacked the pieces carefully, creating a stable load that rose about 18 inches above the sled bed. The weight was substantial, perhaps 150 pounds of seasoned oak. He positioned himself at the tunnel entrance in the shed, grasped the rope handle, and began pulling the loaded sled into the passage. The sled moved smoothly. The packed earth floor of the tunnel provided a firm surface. Tobias crawled forward, pulling the sled behind him. The tunnel was completely dark except for the light from the entrance behind him and a faint glow ahead from the opening under his cabin floor. The crawl took approximately 5 minutes. When he emerged inside his cabin, rising up through the floor opening with the sled full of dry firewood, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The system worked exactly as he had envisioned. He made several more test runs over the following days, refining his technique. He learned the optimal loading pattern for the sled. He discovered that leaving the floor opening uncovered allowed light into the tunnel, making navigation easier. He realized that the slight downward grade from cabin to shed meant pulling the loaded sled toward the cabin was easier than pushing the empty sled back to the shed. Every detail mattered. Every refinement improved the system. In September, Jakob Schneider came to visit, and Tobias decided to demonstrate what he had built. Jakob watched with growing astonishment as Tobias lifted the removable floor section, revealing the tunnel entrance below. Tobias descended into the opening, crawled through the passage, and emerged moments later in the woodshed. Jakob walked outside and stood at the shed entrance, seeing Tobias wave at him from inside. Tobias loaded the sled, pulled it back through the tunnel, and climbed up through the cabin floor with a full load of firewood. Jakob stared at the demonstration in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "Tobias, you spent 4 months digging a tunnel when you could have just stacked wood inside your cabin like everyone else does. Fire risk?" Tobias replied simply, "So build a smaller shed closer to the door. Still requires going outside during storms." Jakob shook his head slowly. "You dug an 18-foot tunnel to avoid a 30-foot walk. You built a passage through your own foundation. You spent an entire summer on this." "Yes, Tobias, I say this as a friend. This is madness. You've solved a problem that doesn't exist. When was the last time anyone died trying to reach their woodshed?" Jakob stopped abruptly, realizing what he had said. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean 30 feet killed Anna and Emil," Tobias said quietly. "This ensures it never happens again." Jakob left troubled, and the story spread quickly through the scattered settlements. Within weeks, Tobias Reichert's tunnel became a local joke among the frontier community. Travelers passing through the area would detour slightly to see Reichert's mine shaft or the German's burrow. Men gathered at Jakob Schneider's cabin to share stories. each retelling adding new embellishments. Some said Tobias had dug tunnels connecting every building on his property. Others claimed he was planning an entire underground house. The kindest interpretation was that grief had made him eccentric. The less charitable suggested his mind had broken completely. William Hess, a traveling carpenter who worked throughout the western Virginia settlements, stopped at Tobias's homestead in October. Unlike most visitors, Hess actually examined the construction with professional interest. He crawled through the tunnel, studied the foundation breach, and inspected the log stacking technique. When he emerged, his assessment was measured. "The engineering is sound," he admitted. "I've never seen a foundation breach done without causing settlement. Your support structure is excellent. The horizontal log construction is clever." "But?" Tobias prompted, hearing the reservation in Hess's voice. "But it seems like an enormous solution to a very small problem. In my 20 years of frontier building, I've never heard of someone dying trying to reach a woodshed, except..." Hess caught himself. "I'm sorry. Your situation was unique. But for most people, stockpiling wood inside is simpler." Tobias didn't argue. He had learned that people would understand or they wouldn't. Explanation was pointless. He simply continued his preparations for winter, stocking his woodshed completely with cords of split oak, ash, and hickory. He practiced moving through the tunnel until he could navigate it in complete darkness, counting hand placements to know exactly where he was in the passage at any moment. He refined his sled loading technique, learning to stack wood in patterns that maximized load capacity while maintaining stability. In November, Heinrich Weber, an elderly settler who had lived in the mountains for 30 years, visited several homesteads with an unusual warning. Weber was 73 years old, weathered and lean, with a kind of practical wisdom that came from surviving decades in an environment that killed younger, stronger men. He told anyone who would listen that a bad winter was coming. "Feels like 1816, he said, referring to the infamous year without summer when frost struck every month and crops failed across the northern states. "My bones know. Storms coming that'll make grown men pray." Most neighbors dismissed Weber's warning as the superstition of an old man. Winter was always hard in the mountains. You prepared as best you could and endured. Jakob Schneider laid in his usual wood supply. Matthias Keller, who lived half a mile up the valley with his wife Greta and 3 children, cut enough firewood to fill his shed and stacked additional cords along his cabin wall. Standard preparations for a standard winter. Tobias took Weber's warning seriously and doubled his wood supply, filling every available space in his shed. The storm arrived on January 9, 1844. It began as light snow in the early morning hours, the kind of snowfall that seemed unremarkable. By noon, the intensity had increased. By evening, the wind had risen to a howl that shook cabin walls. Temperature plummeted to -15 degrees. The snow continued without pause, driven by winds that created whiteout conditions beyond the windows. Tobias sat by his fireplace, listening to the storm rage outside, and felt no fear. His woodshed was full. His tunnel was ready. By day 3 of the storm, the snow had reached 4 feet deep around Tobias's cabin. The wind continued relentlessly, creating drifts that reached 6 and 7 feet against the northern walls of structures throughout the valley. Temperature remained brutally cold, never rising above -10 degrees, even during midday hours. Tobias established a routine that would sustain him through the coming weeks. Each morning, he lifted the removable floor section and descended into his tunnel. He crawled through the passage to the woodshed, loaded his sled with enough firewood for 12 hours, and pulled it back through the tunnel into his cabin. The entire process took less than 15 minutes. He never opened his exterior door. The cabin's heat remained contained, the interior temperature stable and comfortable. Through his window, when visibility allowed, he could see Jakob Schneider's cabin across the valley. On day 5, he watched Jakob struggle through waist-deep snow to reach his woodshed. The journey of perhaps 40 feet took Jakob nearly 30 minutes. He fought against wind that threatened to knock him down, visibility so poor that he had to use a rope tied between his cabin and shed to find his way. Jakob made it successfully, but the effort was clearly exhausting and dangerous. Tobias knew that such trips could only continue for so long before someone miscalculated, before exhaustion or disorientation proved fatal. By day 7, most homesteads in the valley were showing less smoke from their chimneys. Families were rationing their wood supplies, burning less to make their fuel last longer, which meant colder interiors and increased risk of freezing. Tobias's chimney continued, producing steady smoke. He maintained his normal fire, kept his cabin warm, used wood without concern because he could access his full supply regardless of conditions outside. From a distance, to observers like Jacob, who occasionally glimpsed his cabin through breaks in the storm, it appeared impossible. How was Tobias Reichert keeping a full fire burning when everyone else was running dangerously low? Day 9 brought tragedy that Tobias witnessed from his window. Matthias Keller, the neighbor who lived half a mile up the valley, appeared in the whiteout conditions, struggling toward his woodshed. Tobias saw him briefly, a dark figure moving through the snow, and then Matthias disappeared into the storm. He never reappeared. Tobias watched for over an hour, hoping to see Matthias return to his cabin, but saw nothing. The storm was too severe to attempt a rescue. Going outside meant risking his own life, and Tobias had no way to know which direction Matthias had gone after losing sight of him. The storm continued with unrelenting intensity. Day 10, 11, 12, 13. Tobias maintained his routine, moving through his tunnel twice daily, keeping his fire strong, staying warm and safe. He ate well from his stored supplies. He slept comfortably. He read by firelight in the evenings. The tunnel had transformed a deadly siege into mere inconvenience. His cabin had become a fortress not through thick walls or defensive positions, but through a simple underground passage that eliminated his dependence on exterior access during the storm. Innovation had created invulnerability where strength would have failed. The storm finally broke on January 26, 1844, after 17 days of continuous snowfall and brutal cold. Tobias emerged from his cabin for the first time since the storm began and surveyed a transformed landscape. Snow lay 6 to 8 feet deep across the valley, sculpted into massive drifts by the constant wind. The sky was clear and painfully blue, the air still dangerously cold, but without the killing wind. His first task was checking on his neighbors, a grim duty he approached with growing dread. Jakob Schneider's family had survived, but barely. When Tobias reached their cabin, he found them huddled together near a dying fire, wrapped in every blanket and piece of clothing they owned. Jakob's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. "We burned furniture the last 3 days," Jakob said, his voice rough. "The table, 2 chairs, part of the bed frame. We couldn't reach the woodshed anymore. The snow was too deep, the cold too severe. I tried on day 14 and made it halfway before I had to turn back. Thought we would freeze to death in our own home." Jakob looked at Tobias more carefully, noticing that he appeared well-fed, rested, and healthy. "You never ran out. The tunnel. You used the tunnel." It was a statement, not a question, the realization of what Tobias had actually built finally, becoming clear. "You never had to go outside at all." "No," Tobias confirmed simply. The tunnel worked exactly as designed. They found Matthias Keller 2 days later, his body buried in snow 200 feet from his shed. He had become disoriented in the whiteout, wandered in the wrong direction, and frozen to death while his destination was within reach. His widow Greta had survived with their 3 children by burning everything combustible in the cabin: furniture, tools, even some of the interior wall planking. They had been perhaps 12 hours from freezing when the storm finally ended. Tobias brought them firewood and food, helping them recover enough to function. Over the following weeks, as the community recovered and assessed the damage, the attitude toward Tobias's tunnel transformed completely. No one made jokes anymore. Jakob Schneider came to Tobias in early February and asked directly, "Will you show me how you built it? I'm rebuilding my woodshed this spring." "I want to incorporate your design," Tobias agreed without hesitation. He walked Jakob through every aspect of the construction: the excavation depth and width, the log selection criteria, the horizontal stacking technique, the foundation breach method, the drainage considerations, the sled design. He shared every detail freely, holding nothing back. Jakob listened with intense focus, asking questions about specific measurements and techniques. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was a man learning something he recognized as essential to survival. Peter Vogel, a 28-year-old newcomer who had arrived in the valley the previous autumn, approached Tobias in March with plans for a new cabin. "I want to build with the tunnel from the start," Peter said. "Design the whole structure around it. Can you help me plan the layout?" Tobias spent a week working with Peter, showing him how to integrate the tunnel system into initial construction rather than adding it afterward. William Hess returned to the valley in spring of 1844 and spent 3 days studying Tobias's tunnel system with renewed interest. The carpenter who had dismissed the design as excessive now recognized its genius. "I was wrong," Hess admitted bluntly. "This isn't solving a problem that doesn't exist. This is solving a problem everyone faces, but most don't survive to learn from. I'm incorporating this technique into my standard building recommendations for mountain homesteads." Over the next 5 years, variations of Tobias's design spread throughout western Virginia settlements and into neighboring regions. Not everyone adopted the system. The tunnel required significant additional work during construction, demanded careful planning, and needed skills that some frontier builders lacked. But those who had experienced severe winters, who had lost family members or nearly died themselves, began incorporating the design into new construction or retrofitting existing homesteads. The core principle remained consistent across variations: a protected passage integrated into the foundation structure, connecting wood storage to living space without requiring exterior access. By 1847, a settlement 15 miles to the northeast survived a 12-day blizzard with 0 casualties. 4 families, all living in cabins with tunnel systems, endured conditions that would have killed them in traditional structures. One of the survivors wrote a letter to Tobias that spring. "Your design saved our lives. We never ran out of fuel. We stayed warm while the storm raged. Our children are alive because you shared your knowledge freely." Tobias continued living in his cabin, maintaining his tunnel system through the years. He replaced logs that showed signs of rot, ensured drainage remained functional, and kept the passage clear and accessible. He never remarried. The cabin that had once held his family now held only him and his memories. He became known throughout the region as a quiet expert on winter survival construction, helping younger settlers plan their homesteads with integrated tunnel systems. He never charged for his advice, never sought recognition, simply shared what he had learned because others needed to survive the same conditions that had killed Anna and Emil. The winter of 1856 brought another massive storm system, 13 days of snow and brutal cold that tested the valley's homesteads once again. Tobias was 55 years old now, moving more slowly but still capable. His tunnel, 14 years old, functioned perfectly. He moved through it with the practiced ease of thousands of previous trips, accessing his wood supply without difficulty while the storm raged outside. When the weather cleared, his neighbors found him healthy and comfortable, his cabin warm, his firewood supply still substantial. By the late 1850s, historians estimate that approximately 24 homesteads in the region used tunnel systems, with the technique spreading into eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina mountains. Different communities called it by different names: ground shed, underpass shed, or foundation tunnel. The original name Reichert Tunnel faded as the technique became standard practice, absorbed into the general body of frontier building knowledge without attribution to its creator. Tobias Reichert died quietly in his cabin in 1859. He was 60 years old, alone, found 3 days later by Jakob Schneider, who had come to check on him. They buried him on the hillside next to Anna and Emil, the 3 graves marked with carefully shaped stones.